Okay. So I'm Mary. I work for Crisis Response for Southeast Minnesota. I'll talk a little bit more about what Crisis Response does at the end, but my earring just fell out. My mask must have removed it. We provide mental health crisis services to individuals in the community. There's some structuring done with that. So it's a large geographical area we serve. So there's 3 hubs. I work out of South Central Human Relations Center in the Owatonna office. Some of you might not know, but South Central Human Relations Center is a community mental health center, and they have offices in Waseca, Owatonna, and Casson. So before I get going too much, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. One thing that I do a lot, I've been told in presentations, is say I had a college professor in philosophy who so much I couldn't understand anything else that was being said. If I get to that point, just raise your hand and say, you're umming too much. I try not to do that, but anyway, usually I get a laugh with that, but not so much today. You guys are ready to be done. I'm going to talk about something really exciting in suicide. So if that's interest any of you, prior to doing mental health work, I did work with victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. That kind of brought me to doing mental health work because I really struggled to talk with them about the effects that the trauma that they were experiencing had on them. And I saw a number of people go into really dark places, and I had a really hard time telling them that I thought that they needed professional help. So I got into working in a residential treatment facility and went back to victim services only to return to mental health. I feel that this is an area that we really need some work. And I think that as we go through this first part, you're going to see a lot of why that is. So our learning objectives today: what is suicide and its prevalence, increase awareness of risk factors and warning signs, how to help someone in crisis, and what local resources are available. So suicide prevalence. In the United States, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. What comes above that, right? Accidents, heart disease, some other natural causes that people die from. So suicide, we find that a large percentage of individuals who die by suicide have diagnosed mental illness. Another large percent maybe have not been diagnosed, but based on the history that we get from their family, we could say that they were likely depressed. We know that depression and a lot of other mental illnesses are treatable. So this is something to be concerned about. Last year, 48,344 individuals died by suicide, and there were 1.4 million attempts. So more Americans die by suicide each year than are killed in car accidents. Why aren't we talking about it? I'm going to talk a little bit more later on, and you see one of the graphs about some of the trends that have happened with suicide. And I want to talk about what's preventing us from talking about this more, or maybe why we hadn't talked about it before and now you're starting to hear about it more. Oh, I missed one. Is it not moving for you? What am I doing? You know what? I bet I'm doing wrong. Hold on. That's still not moving. Makes music. Hold on, it says resume slideshow. That's the problem. There we go. So I already went over this. You all have this in your handouts too, so you're not too lost from what I was saying. So this is the statistic about the difference between car accidents and suicides. And then the statistic that I already mentioned, the number of people that died by suicide in 2018, that's about how many people fit in the TCF Bank Stadium. So if you've ever been in there, This is just for perspective, because I think we hear numbers like that and we can't really like grasp what that is. Do you all live in this area, like in the Waseca area? That's equivalent to the population of Waseca and Freeborn counties in total, not just like the cities, the whole entire county. So if you can imagine all those people dying by suicide every year, that's super impactful, right? So this is something that we should be talking about more. There were over 479,000 emergency department visits for self-inflicted injury in 2017. So you think about, like, what do people go into the emergency room for? You think about what an emergency room is for, right? You think about people coming in with heart attacks, stroke, lacerations, broken bones. And then you have people who go in there for mental health. So this is one of the things that Minnesota tried to do when they created crisis response, was they're saying our emergency departments are inundated with mental health cases. And that's not the place for people with mental health issues to be unless they are so in critical of condition that they need hospitalization. So it's part of what we're trying to do. We want to get the word out about where people are at and what their needs are and how we can help them at all levels. Because there are people who live in our society every day with thoughts of suicide. That might surprise some of you. Some people who don't come into conversation a lot about mental health with people might be really surprised that there are people who just live every single day thinking about, maybe today will be the day. Maybe I'll get the courage today. Maybe I should act on that plan that I've had today. But what's keeping people from doing that? And we're going to talk more about that. So where's the federal funding to fight suicide? There was some grants that were given out to SAMHSA in the last couple of years to help with suicide prevention. So they do some trainings with that. We had somebody through crisis response get trained to do some train the trainer for suicide prevention. There are a number of programs out there. Maybe some of you have heard of the Yellow Ribbon program. People get really confused about wanting people to call that number to get services. The Yellow Ribbon program does not provide services to people. They provide support and education for people to get to the resources that they need. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is a great resource for people. There's a number of suicide prevention programs that schools can bring in to help the youth. And so if that's something that you feel is important, those options are out there. There's the Trevor Project. There's a number of different ones that SAVE does, and the National Suicide Prevention Program. But as you can see on this chart, we're still very underfunded. The amount of money that goes into some of the other things that take people's lives is just vastly disproportionate to how we are helping fight suicide. So this is one of the really impactful things, because you all work with students. Suicide was the second leading cause of death among individuals aged 10 to 34. What do you think was the number one leading cause of death? Accidents? Accidents. Not necessarily car accidents. All the accidents that could happen to a person combined is the first leading cause of death for people of that age category. Fourth, for people ages 35 to 54. And people are really worried about homicide, but we can see that suicide is a lot more prevalent than homicide in the United States. So in Minnesota, it's the 8th leading cause of death, and nationally it's the 10th. And you'll see the numbers vary from state to state. There's some maps out there. People are more interested in statistics. I really just want to bring some attention to the prevalence so that people understand like why we're talking about this. Why are we having a whole hour about suicide prevention? It can be kind of daunting to talk about, and I know that you probably all weren't excited to come to a presentation this afternoon about suicide, but it's really important for a number of reasons. This graph right here talks about the suicide rates by age. You can find all of this information on the Center for Disease Control and Prevention website. That's where I have that listed at the end of the presentation, and you can go and see these graphs and these charts to kind of see where, actually I think this one came not from that website, but this is where all the statistics came from. But I think this one was off of the, I'll have to look, American Foundation for Suicidology, I think, but I'll check on that. If anyone's really interested and they want to look at these some more, because you can go across and see exactly where all the numbers are with the ages and the demographics. So race and ethnicity. Suicide does not affect everybody based on their age and their gender and their race equally. We see disproportionate numbers among white individuals, a lot lower among Black and Asian Americans. American Indians have a lot higher suicide rates. We also know that mental health in American Indians is much higher. Suicide rates for females by race and ethnicity. Suicide rates for females are a lot lower than that of males. However, females have a lot more suicide attempts than males. And this is for males. You can, maybe it's kind of hard to tell, but the numbers on the left side are they increase in value differently, because sometimes the graph kind of looks the same when you flip from one to the other, but the numbers are substantially different. And what methods people use. This is really significant. This is the reason why the attempts from women are oftentimes less fatal than that of men, because men are more likely to use firearms, where women are more likely to use less lethal methods, such as overdosing or cutting. So this is just kind of a graph to show where homicide and suicide intersected, and the suicide rates grew higher than the homicide rates. One of the positive things about this is that we saw that homicide rates went down, so we can be happy for that. But that's one of the things that we'll talk about later with risk factors, is that sometimes when people are really depressed or affected by other mental illness, they also have thoughts of harming other people. So this is where I want to talk a little bit more about what's happened over the years with suicide rates. And I really feel that it's important to talk about this, because I said about 3 years ago, I said, really, suicide rates have not increased that much. They are increasing. It's concerning. But suicide has always been very prevalent. I don't know what the median age in this room is. It's hard to tell with masks on, and I'm not a very good judge of age anymore. I used to be a lot better. But I don't know if some of you remember, but we rarely ever heard about suicide. Now it's all over the place. And I'm sure that's for a number of reasons. One is because we're more connected. We're talking about things. We have social media that gets things around faster. The news covers more issues, especially surrounding mental health. We're talking about mental health more, right? How many of you knew what was wrong with that neighbor or that uncle? You know, people just used other words to define how people were. They said things like weird or different or sketchy. We would talk about people in that way. And now we find out that maybe that person has a diagnosis of bipolar or schizophrenia, or has a severe anxiety disorder, or maybe was always really depressed. And when people would go to mental health units, we wouldn't say that they went to the hospital for their mental health. We would just say that they went away for a while. And when people would die by suicide, if we knew about it, it was pretty uncommon. I remember growing up, one person in my community died by suicide that I knew of. How many more? Families hide that. I'm sure that even, in small towns that's not always talked about. I'm sure that, it could be put on the death certificate that somebody died of unknown causes, when it was probably really known that person died by suicide. So we're talking about it more, which is making it more known. But you can still see that it's still increasing. So now that we're talking about mental health, we need to really make it okay for people to get that help that they need. And part of that is the role that you all play and getting people to the resources and really being able to talk about it, not only with students, but in your social situations, in your familial situations, and just in society in general. So an average of one person every 11.9 minutes killed themselves. That equals to 121 people a day. 3.3 male deaths by suicide for each female death, and that firearm suicide is the #1 leading cause of death by suicide. One thing that I've really been trying to work on over the last couple of years, it came to me one day when I must have been in a presentation, and somebody said it was because it was a survivor of suicide, and she said, it really bothers me when people say that people commit suicide. And she talked about that a little bit. And what do you commit? When you commit things, you commit crimes, right? You do things that are wrong. And a lot of that comes from the religious belief that suicide is wrong. It's something that is a sin in the Christian faith. And when you think about what suicide really is that it's somebody who's very, very sick from a disease. They're in a lot of pain, and they want to escape that pain, and ending their life is the only way that they can figure out to do that. And so it was really impactful when she said that to me, and she said, so I really like to use the words like death by suicide or died by suicide, not committed suicide, because that really gives a negative connotation. And so I've really been practicing that, to say things like a suicide attempt, non-completed suicide. And it's really uncomfortable, I think. I mean, how many of you have ever asked somebody, are you having thoughts of suicide? Just a couple people in the room. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to just come out and ask somebody, have you thought about suicide? And the more that you do it, which I hope you don't have to do it often, but I mean, for everybody that you have a conversation with that is saying, oh, I've just felt a little depressed lately. Oh yeah, sometimes depression can get really bad. Have you ever thought about suicide? I mean, like, how many people are going to come out and say that? You know? But if somebody's really sharing with you that they've been depressed, maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe that's a way that they're saying, hey, I need you to know that I need some help. And so if that's where your conversation leads, sometimes it's just okay to get to that point where you can be able to talk about that. I'm sorry, I really jump off on tangents, so I know that whole conversation had nothing to do with the non-fatal outcomes. We're going to get back to this. Translates to 1 attempt every 29 seconds. And 25 attempts for every death by suicide, and 3 female attempts for each male attempt. So something about the attempts that's really important. I've done a lot of talks to kids in schools, and I was sitting in a classroom in a gymnasium with a whole grade of 6th graders, which is a great population of kids to work with. I don't know if any of you work with 6th graders, but when you talk about something like suicide, it just brings out a whole nother level of where people are at, right? Because 6th graders, you could be on either spectrum, like, who's ever thought of that before? And then kids who are like, I'm dying right now. Someone please save me. And most times those other kids who have never even thought about it have no idea what's going on with the kids who are really struggling. And the way that it was brought up is that, what about people who are doing it for attention? And my only response was, if somebody needs attention so bad that they're going to try and take their own life, why would we not give that to them? I mean, that's clearly just saying, somebody please give me some help. And so if that's the extreme level that that person's going to, then let's give them that attention, because the last thing we want is for them to take their life because they weren't being given enough attention. And sometimes positive, negative attention, it doesn't matter. Just as long as that person gets the help they need. So we're going to talk about some risk factors and warning signs. When I look at suicide risk, I look at 3 different areas: the chronic risk factors, the acute risk factors, and the warning signs, and then the protective factors. So every space bar is going to give me a new one. I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but there's some chronic risk factors: history of mental illness, previous suicide attempts, any chronic pain. Any people who are experiencing chronic pain a lot of times are very depressed. And a lot of times depression causes physical pain. So it's important to distinguish what's really going on with that individual. Family history of mental illness and suicide, some of the other demographics that are taken into place. If somebody has served in the military, you could possibly be looking at some PTSD, and then history of trauma and substance abuse, along with suicide exposure. I really, really worry about people when they've been struggling with their own mental health and they lose someone close to them to suicide. It is a very, very high risk situation. And so oftentimes we ask people, do you have any family members or close individuals who have died by suicide? Substance abuse is really common with people who are struggling with their mental health because they are using chemicals to cope with the symptoms that they're experiencing. So oftentimes substance abuse and mental illness go hand in hand. That's why we have a lot of dual diagnosis treatment centers. Some acute symptoms: acute physical pain, again, substance use, recent traumatic events. You know, if somebody has a cancer diagnosis, sometimes people can feel really suicidal after that, or another major medical issue. Oh, how do I go back now? Just like that. Job loss, grief or loss. You think about some of the situational things that happen in people's lives, and I'm sure everyone in this room has felt situationally depressed before, at least blue. I always think about depression on a spectrum. On one end, you have the happy every day. In the middle, you have not well. And in the end, you can't live anymore. And a lot of times we all fluctuate in this other half. But what happens when you get down here, you know, and then are you getting the help that you need? And sometimes we can go down here and then we can come right back up here. But a lot of times that's because you have some of the protective factors. So access to lethal means, triggering events, and then specific symptoms. When people have any mental health diagnosis, they are at high risk for suicide. I think about people that I've worked with who have thought disorders, who have delusions every day, who believe that they're being followed, tracked. I have worked with somebody who said, I've never thought about suicide. I don't want to end my life. I have a strong Christian faith. I believe that God thinks that suicide is wrong. I have my family and my kids to live for. My parents need me. And one day, the stress of the delusions just became too much. And it was very shocking, but it taught me a very important lesson, that you can never rule out suicide when somebody is under that type of psychosis, when their brain is altered like that. One good thing is we don't see that in a lot of youth, so that's not something that you will probably come across a lot. However, you could have students who have parents who are experiencing that, and sometimes in the high school levels, the first episode psychosis looks a lot like depression. And so if you have a student who is having some bizarre thinking or maybe appears to be, listening or talking to somebody who you don't see that's there, it's really, really important to get that person help as soon as possible, because the earlier the intervention, the more effective the treatment is. So suicide warning signs. These are the observed and reported behaviors. One of the biggest things that I think that crisis response does when helping people get to the hospital is they bring all that collateral information with them and directly relay it to the person who's going to determine if that individual is hospitalized or not. That is probably one of the most important roles that we play when people do go to the hospital, because one of our primary goals is to keep people out of the hospital. We want to keep people in the community if possible. We want to incorporate the supports that are in the community. Hospitalization is not always the best answer for people, even who are high risk. Sometimes it can be more detrimental to their long-term mental health. And so we really want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to get people in the right situation. But those reported behaviors are so important. When you have a student come to you and they say, Katie told me that she doesn't want to live anymore and that she's going to kill herself after school today. Getting that information from that student who told you about this other student is very, very important. And being able to communicate that down the road so that it's not just that person says, no, I never said that. That didn't happen. And I think one of the really hard things too is letting kids know that it's okay to tell somebody if you're worried about their friend. Because sometimes they're so worried that that person's not going to be their friend anymore. And the number one message that I tell them is that if your friend is not alive, they can't be mad at you. So in the end, once they get better, they'll be happy that you told someone, but that seems like a risk you should be willing to take if it saves their life. And then also, what is the patient doing now or saying now? So is path warm is something that we use, one of those great, do they call it an acronym or is it something else? The acronym that we use to kind of talk about remember what some of the symptoms are that we should be looking for in early warning signs. So ideation, are there thoughts of suicide? Is there substance use? Purposelessness? Anxiety? Feeling trapped? Hopelessness? Withdraw. If people are isolating, really not doing the things that they're normally doing, feeling angry. Anger is kind of one thing that I really think is important for people to understand too. I don't know how many people understand irritability. I'm sure any woman who has had their menstrual cycle can really understand irritability from my perspective. But it's something that comes not only with hormonal changes, but also with anxiety and depression. And so a lot of times people just think that I'm mean or I'm heartless. And really, when it comes down to figuring out what's going on, you find out that there's underlying anxiety and depression. And so irritability and anger is one of the most common symptoms for young males to experience when they're experiencing depression. So it's just really, really important that we don't just pass that off as a behavioral characteristic of an individual. Recklessness, people who are doing things that, might be putting their lives in danger, maybe driving really fast in a car, being really promiscuous, having mood changes. And then what are the protective factors? These are really important because sometimes I work with people who have all of the risk factors, but their protective factors are so great that we can make a good plan. So balancing or lowering the risk of likelihood of suicidal behaviors. And this is where I think a lot of you come in that social support and that connectedness. Making kids feel important, like they have worth, like they matter to somebody. Sometimes it's just a matter of you acknowledging that person, saying hi to them. How you doing today? Having a strong therapeutic alliance is important. People who have access to mental health care and are willing to get help, that's like sometimes the only thing that I can write down in protective factors when I meet with somebody. They're willing to get help. They want to get services. And that is so important. Having coping skills is a really great thing. Problem-solving skills. I'm sure a lot of you identify kids who just struggle in general because they lack problem-solving skills. I know a lot of schools are trying to bring DBT programs into schools where they're teaching kids the dialectical behavioral skills that we find are so essential for people to be able to cope. Cultural and religious beliefs, and then biological and psychological resilience. Are you all familiar with the ACEs study? Okay. So the ACEs, just in case people aren't, is the adverse childhood experiences. And they did these studies back in the 80s, and they found that individuals who are experience things in their childhood are more likely to have physical, behavioral, and mental health issues as adults. So we're talking like higher risk of heart disease and diabetes and mental illness and death as adults because of things that they experienced when they were children. And so it's really interesting because I thought, well, this is really, really great, but now what do we do about it? Every time people talk about it, it just feels so like, oh gosh. You go in a room and you find all these people who are successful and they have high ACEs. And so I was like, well, what's that about? And then we find out that it's resilience, that they had protective factors, they had connectedness as children that helped them to still be successful as adults. And those other people who maybe weren't as successful, who had those high risk factors, who had high ACEs, they didn't have that when they were kids. They didn't have anybody who believed in them. They didn't have anyone who said, you can do this, I know you can. They didn't have anyone who check in with them to make sure that they were okay, that they were safe in their home. So helping someone in crisis. What is a mental health crisis? It's defined as a behavioral, emotional, or psychiatric situation which without timely mental health intervention would result in a significant reduced level of functioning or replacement. What the heck does that mean? So this is something that puts you at risk of harm, something that makes it so that you can't cope with the symptoms that you're experiencing, and what affects your health, happiness, or productivity. I like the word stress. People have a hard time saying these are mental health symptoms. People have a lot more easy time identifying what's going on as stress. What are the stressors you're experiencing right now? And so if you're struggling to find a way to ask someone about things that you're observing that you're concerned about, ask about stress. What kind of stress do you have right now? It's a really great way to get people to talk about some of the bad things that are going on without maybe labeling it as that. Because once they label it as that, then that's what it is, and then they have to deal with it. So there's no prerequisite for having a mental health crisis. It can look different for every person. Never does somebody call me and I say, well, that's not really a crisis. You just better call somebody else. We want to make sure that people are feeling supported in however they view their situation. And you know, it's hard too when somebody says, no, I'm just fine. And you say, well, I really think you need to get help. You're having a mental health crisis and identify that for them. It's not always the best thing to force somebody to get help when you're really concerned about their life, then it's necessary. However, I think that it's also important that you provide those options to people so that they know that help is there for them when they're ready to take that step. People are a lot more inclined to engage in the services when they want it themselves and not when they're being forced. So some examples of a mental health crisis, I'm sure you can all imagine when people have suicidal ideation, self-injurious behavior, that we already talked about, suffering from a loss and hallucinations. But I think it's also important to recognize that sometimes the culmination of the stress just gets to be too much, and people don't have to necessarily be thinking about suicide to be in a mental health crisis, right? Like, as a student, I just have no motivation. I can no longer get up and go to school, or if I am, I'm not showering. Maybe I haven't showered in a week or a month. Hopefully you're not running into kids in that situation, but if you are, they've probably already been identified that they have a mental health crisis. Hopefully they just have access to being able to do that, and it's more about something that is detrimental to their functioning. So we want to make sure that anytime that somebody has a decline in functioning from their baseline level, from how they normally function, that they're able to access services. So how can we help? What can you do? One thing is you can always provide resources to people. Listen in a non-judgmental way and validate. Sometimes it's really hard to not want to talk and solve and fix everything, but a lot of times what people need is just to have somebody hear them. They just need to be listened to. I can't tell you the number of times that I've sat on the phone with somebody and they're just talking and talking and talking and talking, and I think that it's going to be about my turn to ask them questions, and then they say, "Oh, well, I feel a lot better now, thanks." I'm like, "Well, I didn't do anything, but you're welcome," right? However I can be of service, that's the easiest call that I can take. But just not trying to impose your own beliefs or your own values on them, letting them share things. I found a lot of times that when I have a hard time understanding what somebody says or means by something, that if I say, "Can you tell me more about that?" that then it will lead me to be able to understand that. And then I don't know if you've all had some motivational interviewing done. I know that that's a really big thing that's being taught now, but doing some of that reflection. So if somebody says something to you and you just want to make sure that you have it right, repeat back to them what you think that they've said, and maybe do some paraphrasing. And then a lot of times that will kind of give you that you're on the right track. Yep. Either they'll say, no, that's not at all what I meant, or they'll say, "Yeah, exactly, like you understand." So that listening is really important. Talk openly and honestly about suicide. One of the myths is that if you talk about suicide, that will give people an idea. That is not the way that suicide works. When you bring that up for people, a lot of times it gives them permission to then talk about something that they've been thinking about. And if they haven't been thinking about it, which happens all the time when I talk to people, they'll say, "Oh no, I haven't thought about suicide. I've never brought it up to somebody and have them be like, 'Oh, you know what, that's a really great idea. I should just go kill myself.'" Like that never happens. So don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to ask people if they have a plan. Because if somebody says, "Yes, I've thought about suicide," the next question should be, "Have you thought of a plan? Have you thought of a way?" Thank you for sharing that with me. I know that that's a hard thing to talk about. I'm glad that you trusted me enough to tell me. I really want to make sure that you're safe. Have you thought of a plan? Seek and encourage help. Ask what you can do to help them, and then also encourage them to get the help that they need. Not everybody needs professional help, right? Like I said, if we've all been on the other side of the continuum, we all know that sometimes we can get back without getting professional help. But sometimes our chemicals can get imbalanced and we can't get them back on our own, regardless of all the coping skills in the world that we have. Sometimes it's going to take some professional help. maybe medication. Sometimes it's important for us to be able to process with a therapist. It's really important to have impartial people to talk to when you're struggling with a major life situation. Reaching out on behalf of someone that helps them to take difficult steps. So I really feel that taking those steps with that person, if they say, yeah, I'm willing to talk to somebody, if that means you walk them to the counselor's office, if that means you call the crisis line number with them, if that means that you call their parent with them, if they've shared that with you and they've told you that they're willing to get help, please take those few extra minutes to help them to take that next step. The symptoms of depression and anxiety alone are what get in the way of people getting help, right? It's like the hardest disease ever, because it's like, well, all you need to do is this. But the symptom is you have no motivation to do that, or you don't think that you're worth that. So it's really, really important that if they trust you enough to share with you with what's going on, that you help them get to the next step. And then finally, removing lethal means. If they've shared with you a plan, it's really important to make sure that safety occurs, that you let somebody know who can help remove those means. If that means that they said they were going to, crash their car into somebody, you say, could I get your car keys? I really don't want you to do that. And if you could give those to me so that I can get them to someone who can help, we'll make a plan so that you can be safe. And then you'll get your car keys back, right? As soon as you're feeling better. Because that's one of the things too. That's one of the reasons why kids especially are so hesitant to share their concerns with adults, is because they're afraid that their freedom is going to be removed. I mean, you think about that, like when kids drink in high school, they don't want to tell their parents, because then their parents are never going to let them do anything again. That's why they don't share their mistakes, because they're going to have repercussions that are going to be unfavorable to them. It's the same thing with mental health. They don't want to tell somebody that they've had thoughts of suicide, because then they might not get to do something that they really wanted to do. And that's all we need to hold on to, is that they have something that they really want to do. And so we need to focus on those positive things in order to make sure that they're safe in the moment. So sometimes talking about it isn't necessarily going to take away all the positive things. It's going to just reinforce that we have a safety plan in place. And then call 911 or law enforcement if necessary. If that individual is not responsive or not willing to get the help that they need, or you feel that their life is in danger, call 911. So there are times when we have to take people's rights away from them. I don't like to do that at all. I like to have somebody make that choice for themselves. And I try to use that whenever I'm working with somebody, is this, I want you to be able to do this, and I don't want to have to tell you that you have to do this, because that usually isn't the best end result. And so only in specific situations where somebody has the thoughts, the plan, the means, and the intent, can we take people's rights away from them. And I know a lot of times that's really hard for people to grasp, because we're worried and maybe we don't understand where that person's at. But that's when somebody needs to be in the emergency room, is when those things are in place. And so a lot of times people hear the word suicide and they think, oh, we got to go to the emergency room. And that's not necessarily the best place for them, because the emergency room cannot handle the people who come in with anxiety, feeling I'm having a heart attack. We've already done all the tests on you. Your heart is fine. We've talked about all the stress. This is likely anxiety. So you have people who come in that situation all the time. You have people who come in and say, well, I shared with my boyfriend or my girlfriend or my husband or my wife or my mom or whoever, my teacher, that I had considered suicide, and they told me that I needed to come here. Okay, and then when they ask the questions, they find out that really there was no intent on acting on them. They just had thoughts about it, and maybe for different situations that were going on. And so the emergency room is going to send them home, probably after a lengthy process that they go through, and they're going to be in the same situation as when they came out. So we really want to make sure that we're getting people to the right resource. So what are those resources? In the school, you have the social workers, you as teachers and principals and paras are all resources for individuals. They have school-linked mental health therapists, and in the Waseca schools, they have family service coordinators. So all of these individuals are really important in your front line of defense. Oh, well, I was just looping them in with the school social workers. So thank you. Yes, school counselors. I'll have to add that to my PowerPoint. I work really closely with all the school counselors and school social workers. I usually just, I'm sure that there's some title things that people get offended by, but everyone's just as valuable. If somebody is of a social work service to somebody, they are very valuable to the students. In the community, in Waseca, we have Fernbrook Family Center, South Central Human Relations Center, Compassionate Counseling, Wright and Associates, and then Crisis Response. Did I leave anything out if anybody knows of any other services? Okay, just with my memory. So I want to talk just a minute about what crisis response is so that you understand a little bit about that. So when the state of Minnesota said, we need to stop having all these people come into the emergency departments, we want every county within the state to have a mobile mental health unit. And so the Crest region, which is over in like Olmsted County, including all the 10 counties in the southeast corner of Minnesota, came up with crisis response for southeast Minnesota. All counties in Minnesota now have a mobile mental health unit. So in Mankato, which serves Blue Earth County, Le Sueur County, the counties kind of around Waseca, is the South Central Crisis Center. And so this service is available to anyone. That's why the numbers on the final slide that you get are important to access, because they're your local resources. It's really great for people to have the national resources, the online resources, but those resources who can get somebody to your door in a short amount of time is oftentimes really important, right? We're not an emergency service. We're not going to show up in 20 minutes. You can't call like it's law enforcement and expect somebody to come with lights and sirens. But to have somebody come, make a plan, make a safety plan, that's what we want to do. So it's a 24/7 service that serves all ages, no cost to individuals. One of the great things is that the state gave out grants, which of course they always do that, where they're like, we're going to give you this money and then it's going to be free to everyone. And then you find out 5 years later that was just to get you going, and now you have to find a way to sustain. And we know that there's not a whole lot of money in the mental health business, so we really need to get on top of insurance companies to pay for the services that people need. And that's for a whole nother presentation. But still, it's no cost to people right now, so we're going with that. And then one of the really great things is we are going to add this Southeast Regional Crisis Center is being built in Rochester, and they're going to open in April of 2021, and that is going to provide adolescent crisis beds. And that is a huge, huge benefit for our area because we have not had access to that in the past, and we have a ton of youth who don't meet the criteria for a hospitalization, or they've been waiting in an emergency department for 5 days to be hospitalized, and there's no beds, or they have to go to Fargo, North Dakota to get hospitalized. And so the crisis bed is going to be a really great resource for us. So when people call into the crisis line, there's a triaging to determine, what their needs are. They provide information and referrals. They do some supportive counseling to people, help with some coping skills. But then if they need a mobile response, they dispatch mobile responders, or they call 911 if that's necessary. So if you're ever in doubt and you're with someone, you're like, I'm not sure which way to go with this person, call into the crisis line and they'll help walk you through it, or get you connected to a mobile responder who can do that. So when we do assessments, we go through all those, the risk factors that we talked about already. We want to make sure that people are safe, and we're going to get them to the place that they need to go. And we're going to do that through the intervention plan that we make with people. Face-to-face therapeutic responses. Right now, we're doing as much telehealth as possible. With the increase in cases in our area, we are only seeing people face-to-face if absolutely necessary. We just went back to this at the beginning of the month because cases were rising so high, and one of our responders works at the hospital, and she said, "Nope, we can't keep doing this. We just don't have space at the hospital, and things are going to get really bad if we don't make some changes." And so we think about this a lot, right? Because it's hard. It's hard to not see people face to face. I'm sure you all can appreciate that. And so if somebody has the ability, we're going to do a telehealth response with them. We have a couple different options that we have available. We want to make sure that we're reducing access to the means, that we're getting them the resources they need, that we're maybe, if it's a family member who needs to come stay with them or they need to go somewhere else, maybe out of their home, maybe their parents are the problem. We want to make sure that people have a safe place to be. One of those things when the crisis center comes is having access to that for youth. So connection for people returning to the community. This is a service that is provided, unfortunately, just by me during the daytime. And I serve Waseca, Steele, Dodge, and Mower counties. I'm a little overwhelmed. I just took last week off and I'm paying for it. Come back Monday morning and you'll get the load of a lifetime dumped on you. But it's a really great thing because, like I said before, a lot of what gets in the way of people getting the help that they need is being able to take those steps because of their symptoms. It's really easy to say, oh, okay, well, I'll make this referral for you. You can call and here's the number to call and schedule a therapy appointment. We're going to get you into case management, and then you're going to go see your school counselor. Well, if you don't help somebody follow through with some of those things, taking those steps is really difficult, and that's what stabilization is to help do. Make sure that they're getting connected to those long-term supports and services. So it's just meant to be short-term, intensive, making sure that they're getting that connection. And then I have listed the sources, resources, and contact information. The crisis text line is a really great thing for kids. Text MN to 741-741. Kids can get a mobile response that way as well. And the NAMI warm line is another good one because people who work on the NAMI warm line are people who have experienced mental health themselves. So they might not be mental health professionals in the sense that they're going to give advice or recommendations, but they are a good listening ear. So if you know somebody who just needs somebody to listen to them, to provide them with support, maybe some validation, the warm line is a really great resource. And then of course we have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And then I also included the South Central Crisis Center number on there because there are so many students who are on the border or maybe are going to the Mankato area or outside of Waseca County into some of the other counties that I wanted to make sure that you had that contact information too. I put my number at the bottom. I trust that you all will not give that out to students. You can give out the crisis response number, but my direct line, I just worry that if I wasn't working, it was an evening or a weekend and somebody tried to call me in crisis and then nobody answered, that they would feel like, they didn't care. I want to make sure that we go through the right avenues to get people the help they need, and that if they need that assistance, they can call into the crisis line. However, if you do have questions that you don't want to ask today, or if you want to talk over a situation or have a concern for someone, you can feel free to call. So now I want to see if there are any questions. I know I talk really fast and I ramble a lot. We probably don't have a whole lot of time. 4 minutes. Go.
What do you see with our pandemic?
Yeah, so that was...
When can you predict that
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. If everyone didn't hear, what's the question is what are we seeing with the pandemic? What can we think is going to happen with suicide rates? There has been some research done already about what's happening. Suicide rates have been increasing anyway, so I don't know if we can attribute that to the pandemic or not, or if we can contribute to other stressors that are happening because of the pandemic. We're not really sure. All I know is that when the pandemic started and until right now, we have not seen a dramatic increase in calls to the crisis line like we expected. I thought things were going to get out of control, and I don't know what the reason is for that. At first in the spring, I thought, well, it's because everyone's outside exercising. They're all using healthy coping skills. And now I'm like, well, maybe it's just because people are sick of it and they're not caring and they're not following the rules, right? Who knows? Who knows what the reasons are? I could speculate all day long for a million things. But that's another reason why it's important for people to know that this help is there and you don't have to want to end your life today in order to get the help, because we know that everybody who does end up taking their life didn't go from perfectly happy to ending their life in one day, right? There was a continuum that they went down where they started believing that things weren't going to be okay. So getting that help early on is a lot easier than at the very end. So I don't have a really good answer for that, but I do just know that one of the things that I said earlier before this was I think a lot of the people who are really being affected are the people who aren't going to ask for help, right? They're the people who are struggling with doing telehealth with all their work, who are the teachers in the schools who are having to adapt and do online lessons as well as in-person lessons, as well as, parenting their own kids and still trying to figure out how to social distance and having maybe some of that social things lacking. I do know, however, that there are a big group of people who are thriving with this, right? People are like, heck yeah, I don't ever want to have to go to work again. I'll work from home for the rest of my life. I really am an extrovert and I love talking to people, but I'm okay with not having to go back to the office. That's fine with me. So it's to each their own. Any other questions? Okay. Well, you've all been really great. Quiet. So great. My email's on there. My phone number's on there. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you.